I'm Phil Heimlich, and welcome to this week's Sanity Check. Is Israel committing genocide in Gaza? Well, according to Peter Beinart, who's a journalism and political science professor, the answer is yes. And this is significant because not only is Beinart Jewish, but he is the editor of a prominent Jewish publication called Jewish Currents, and he has been a fierce defender of Israel through the years. He brings up an interesting analogy. Throughout history, we Jewish people have been like David against Goliath. You can go back to the Middle Ages where Jews were accused of poisoning the wells and causing the plague. Then there were the pogroms in Russia and eventually the Holocaust. But what he says is now things are reversed. Now we're the Goliath. We're the ones that have killed 60,000 Palestinians, and we're the ones cutting off food to millions of starving people. And he's not the only Jewish leader that has made this accusation. Ehud Olmert, former prime minister of Israel, has accused his own government of committing war crimes. And the two leading human rights organizations in Israel have accused Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of committing genocide. Not only are thousands of Israelis demonstrating against these policies, but 600 former Israeli security officials, including one who was head of the Mossad, which is like their CIA, and one who was head of the military, have stated that Hamas is no longer a threat, the killing needs to stop, and the war needs to end. Nobody roots for Goliath, and we shouldn't either. Do you ever wonder who Jesus would hang out with if he came back today? Would it be our political leaders, or maybe our church leaders, or perhaps the CEOs who run our biggest companies? Well, I think to figure out who he'd spend time with, we need to go back to the first century and see who he hung out with then. Well, first there were the tax collectors, and these weren't your typical guys who work at the IRS. These were the most hated figures in Jewish society because they took money from their fellow Jews and gave it to the Romans. And then there were the members of the world's oldest profession, otherwise known as hookers. Jesus hung out with them too. Finally, there's the poor. Jesus not only hung out with them, but he encouraged his followers to give to them. Now, as far as the more powerful groups in society, especially the religious leaders, he didn't have very kind words about them. He called them unwashed tombs and vipers and hypocrites. So if he came back today, I don't see him staying at the White House or addressing Congress or hanging out with a bunch of Christian nationalists. I think to answer the question of who he'd spend time with, we need to ask, well, who are the real dregs of our society? I think one group might be undocumented migrants who live in fear that they're going to be deported any day to a gulag in El Salvador. And then there are the transgender kids who don't seem to fit in with anybody. And what about the young men who hang out on urban street corners selling drugs? I think he might hang out with them too. Remember, Jesus didn't encourage their illegal or unethical activities. In fact, he told them to turn away from their sins, but he hung out with them and he loved them. Maybe we should do the same. Do you live in a racist city? I never thought I did. I live in Cincinnati and I haven't seen really any evidence of discrimination against minorities. Now, I know the horrendous history of slavery and violence and discrimination in the Jim Crow era, but this is a new day. In fact, when I was on Cincinnati City Council, it seemed to me that African Americans had the advantage in hiring because the people on City Council were always pressuring the city manager to hire more African Americans. And they were always asking, what is the percentage of women and African Americans in our workforce? What really ticked me off was to see how the city would give millions of dollars to some minority entrepreneur, and invariably the entrepreneur would either go bust or run off with the money. In fact, I used to accuse the other city council members of playing the race card. I've always been against DEI and reverse discrimination and quotas, so forth and so on. But lately, my perspective has changed. One reason is that I've been on this other podcast for a couple months, and it's usually me with 4 or 5 Black men and women. And I can't help but notice that in listening to their stories, every one of them has been impacted by racism. I have a couple Black friends, one in particular who's a doctor and obviously does very well, but he told me the same thing that his life has been impacted by racism. But what really got my attention was a letter that was just forwarded to me from Kevin Aldridge, who's a friend of mine. He's the editorial page editor of the Cincinnati Enquirer. He's Black, and he recently wrote a column about a brawl in downtown Cincinnati by a bunch of white guys and Black guys. And in response to that, he got this letter. Let me just read you a line or two. It said, if the circumstances are reversed, like you would be losing your tiny little minds. But when it's like you want to say, let's move on. Get your house in order. Teach your low IQ brothers the complex engineering that goes into operating a condom, or are they too stupid? Maybe we all have a lot to learn about race. Hey, I've got great news for everybody. From now on, whenever we get a jobs report from the federal government, we're going to find that we've had thousands of new jobs. How do I know this? Because last week, the director of the Bureau of Labor Statistics released a report showing that job growth was down. But our president took decisive action. He fired the director of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and he's going to appoint someone that's only going to give us good jobs reports. Kind of reminds me of in the Vietnam War when the generals were always telling us there's a light at the end of the tunnel. Despite the fact that 58,000 Americans lost their lives, at least the military gave us hope. President Trump has given us other good news before. Remember during COVID when he told us that COVID would be gone by spring, and he did something about it. What he said was, if we don't test, there won't be any cases. It's the same with the environment. The president told NASA to stop collecting data on the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Well, presto, no more global warming. You remember the show All in the Family? I know I'm dating myself, but it was about Archie and Edith Bunker. Well, one of the funniest episodes is where Archie and Edith go to Edith's cousin Maud's house for Maud's daughter's wedding. Now, you have to understand that Archie and Maud hated each other. So as soon as Archie made some outrageous comment, Maud looked at him and said, Archie, still fighting mental health. Well, that reminds me. One thing we never talk about when it comes to our leaders is how is their mental health? We talk about issues and we talk about their character, but nobody ever talks about the mental health of our leaders. So how do you measure mental health? Well, I'll tell you, you just watch them. Don't just read about them or listen to them. Watch videos of them. For example, take last year's presidential debate between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. Now, no matter how much you might despise Kamala Harris, I think you'd have to admit she appeared relatively stable, capable of a clear thought. Now, Trump, on the other hand, you might remember, he said about immigrants, they're eating the dogs. What? And, and then there was the time during COVID where he recommended that we inject bleach into our bodies to cure COVID. And just recently, he said that he was going to get drug prices down 1,500%. I guess that means that the drug companies are going to pay us to take their drugs. Now, I'm not here to point out how ludicrous these comments are. Well, actually, I think I am here to point that out. But if you want to assess just how mentally stable our leaders are, just go to YouTube and watch some videos. Now, I'm no mental health professional, and I'm sure some of you think I'm the one that needs the therapy. But I challenge anyone to watch 10 to 15 minutes of Donald Trump and tell me he's okay. This has been your Sanity Check with Phil Heimlich. If you enjoyed this podcast, like, subscribe, and share with a friend.